Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Kings Across the Pod, the KCL American Politics Society's official podcast hosted by Roar News. My name's Patrick, and I'm the president of the American Politics Society.
And my name's Casey Jane. I'm the vice president of the American Politics Society.
We thought for the first episode of this podcast, instead of just jumping straight into debates or panels with members and other speakers, we'd like to first give you a little bit of background about our society, why we founded it, why some of us joined, and what our plans are for the future. So I think I'll start by kind of explaining the background of the society. We originally founded it in 2022, right after the midterm elections. And it was because in the UK, there was no other society, university level club or society entirely dedicated to American politics. We obviously have a lot of politics societies, a lot of American societies, but then you put two and two together and you get us. I was the original treasurer for the society from 2022 up to this year, and now I got elected as president. And we have had not the fastest of starts, but we're certainly back on track now. We have a lot of events which, Casey, I think you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined last year at the end of the academic year. Patrick and I are in the same year. I got to go to a lot of the events when he was on the committee, and I found that we had a lot of interest from students that were not American students. And so this year we've put a lot of emphasis on making sure that people know that American politics affects everyone, and so everyone should be educated and should be attending our events. We're very happy to have both American students and international students as a part. And so far this year, we started off with a inclusive social. We had a pub quiz. I do think our American members did have a bit of a had a bit of a head start there
little
because
bit of an advantage.
they had a bit of an advantage because they definitely were American political and pop culture questions. But we then went academic. Our first academic event of the year was a panel. We had 3 speakers, and we were talking about the kind of progression of both the Democratic and Republican parties since 2016. Obviously, with that progression, we ended up actually going a lot further back than 2016. But very interesting, and I think a good way to start off the year. We then had our first student debate. This was in collaboration with the KCL Politics Society, and it went great. We're very happy to have student voices and students who are very involved and passionate about this. Our motion was that this House believes that the United States is still the global hegemon. And both teams really turned out and did amazing. We had the proposition team ended up winning. We had official, debating judge who had a lot of criteria. I'm not the expert there. But then we had a public poll where the proposition won as well. So super fun. And by the time that this is out, we will have had another academic event, another panel in collaboration with KTT, the King's think tank. And this is going to be talking about disinformation and misinformation and how media can affect the upcoming election. Can't really talk too much about that yet because as we're recording this has not happened. But we're really looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I think all in all, we have a pretty good balance of, social fun events and then some more academic ones. Naturally, in the first semester, we're focusing on more domestic politics, like you mentioned, and then second semester, we're going to focus on some foreign policy or just general geopolitics, which should be a very nice balance. We do want to go region by region, I think, in the second semester. And so that should really carve out a very nice balance of American politics with just general international politics. And that's kind of the spiel of the KCL American Politics Society. It's very inclusive. You don't have to be American to join. Obviously, it's not the American Society, it's the American Politics Society. And that's why about 50% of our members are actually non-Americans, and about 50% of our committee as well is non-American. And so that's, again, offers a very nice balance, keeps the Americans accountable, holds them accountable once in a while when needs be, but then the Americans can fight back as they do. But I think what we want to move on next is kind of recap of the election, Casey, right? It's what has happened so far this year. We'll start in January 2024 with the primaries. We'll move on to some of the biggest events that have happened over summer, which there are a lot to talk about. And we'll kind of move into the October surprise or the potential of an October surprise leading into November 5th, where we will actually be hosting a very cool election night event, which we will briefly mention towards the end of the podcast, so stay tuned.
Hmm. So, Patrick and I had a bit of a debate on where to start with this, and it ended up with us deciding on the Republican primaries, which were very entertaining, at least for me, I'm not gonna lie. But this was really important because even though former President Donald Trump, we all knew that he was going to run again, we got to see what some alternatives to a Trump presidency could look like. And so there was a lot of candidates, but Patrick and I think, kind of agreed that the big names that I think kind of set the tone and set the conversation were both Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley.
Exactly. I think, and it kind of shocked a lot of people of how really poorly they actually ended up doing, especially DeSantis. I mean, you look at the midterm elections, and we actually had quite a lot of podcasts here at Roar on our mainstream media playlist where we talked about the midterms. We talked about the implications that the midterms might have on the future nominee for the Republicans. And it really didn't turn out the way many people were expecting it. In the midterms, you obviously saw a lot of Trump endorsed candidates in kind of swing or more competitive states lose.
Hmm.
Um, and then you saw people like DeSantis who completely dominated in places like Florida. And so a lot of people expected DeSantis to be this kind of new leader of the Republican Party, kind of replacing Trump. Obviously, that didn't end up happening. He actually even essentially lost out to Haley, who ended up running for quite a longer period of time than DeSantis did. But were you surprised by that at all? Or did you ultimately think that Trump was just going to be the unanimous victor within the GOP?
I think what was interesting, especially with Nikki Haley's campaign, was that even though they were all still, not all, but a lot were still willing to endorse Trump and willing to accept him when he was ready to step back into the race, I think what I wasn't prepared for at first, but what we saw was Nikki Haley succeeding, I think because she has some similar policies, but she's really appealing to some of this voter base who's kind of done with the abrasive language and maybe some of the issues that people are having with the Trump campaign. And they're seeing maybe policies they like with someone who is a very good communicator and with someone who is just like what some would say not as mean. And so I think that once I saw them campaigning, I was not surprised that Nikki Haley ended up doing so well. I was also not incredibly surprised once Donald Trump was ready to come back into the scene that he ended up getting his support back.
Well, we have to remember Trump was the first Republican candidate to officially announce his candidacy for 2024. He did that, I want to say, almost 2 years before the election.
Hmm.
Um, and then Haley was second in February of 2023, followed by DeSantis in, I want to say, June of that same year. And so the candidacies were pretty spread out. DeSantis starting late might have played a disadvantage. If I feel like if he would have started his campaign right after the midterms when he had all that momentum, when all the Republicans and really a lot of people on both sides of the aisle in America were looking at him as this new young powerhouse in the GOP, he might have really had a bigger chance at winning the nomination, especially with kind of Trump's semi downfall in the midterms and his really glorious turnout. Um, and so I think a lot of people were shocked, um, but a lot of people also would have expected Trump to really, you know, turn out as he did, and really win pretty unanimously. Um, so that was essentially the Republican primaries. The
Hmm.
Democratic side had a pretty different style of primaries. Obviously, you had Biden, who was the incumbent, who ran and won without any major news stories alongside him. I mean, you had RFK Jr. at first, who was Democrat, then turned independent. When we look at the polls, Biden was winning pretty clearly. Um, but then again, no one really expected another Democrat to really challenge him.
Hmm.
Um, and so you look at the difference between the GOP primaries and the Democratic side primaries, and you see a lot of competition, or certainly more competition in the GOP, especially for future years, looking forward to 2028, for example. And then you look at the Democratic Party, which didn't really have as big of a turnout. And now we consider RFK Jr. turning independent, now turning Republican. I suppose. I mean, they did say that if Trump wins, he's going to be RFK will be in Trump's cabinet on, especially on the environment side, with Tulsi Gabbard, another Democrat now turned Trumpist, I guess. And so you don't really see as much competition. And you don't see as many big names that could really take over the party after, well, now after Kamala, right?
Hmm. I think also moving on back to Trump, back to his race and his campaign, I think one of the things that I don't know if we can label as surprising or unsurprising, but something that you can't talk about his campaign without mentioning are all the trials that are happening or that were happening. And so, one of the ones that we think would be most impactful has been the hush money trial that has had a lot of media attention. That is not the only trial that has had a lot of media attention. And the intentional decision for that decision to be postponed, we have till the 26th of November. So, whether that has helped, I personally think that that decision has helped the Trump campaign. I think he has faced a lot of negative feedback, but I don't know if actually his polling numbers have been that affected by these cases that are going on.
I agree. I mean, I definitely think it helped the Trump campaign. I think that there's been this perception over the summer in America that the trial was essentially a form of political persecution, right? That's what a lot of Republicans are saying, which you wouldn't typically see in the capital of democracy, right, in the world. And you wouldn't expect to ever see something like this in America. That's the Republican side.
Hmm.
The Democrat side is saying, well, Trump is now a convicted felon, convicted on 34 counts. If he wins, how are we going to have someone potentially running the country from prison, right? And again, that's more metaphorically because obviously, if Trump wins, and even if he is sentenced to prison, realistically, on the first day in office, he would pardon himself.
Hmm.
Um, but either way, that's the Democrat side and that's the Republican side. And then Harris, I think, started her campaign pretty strongly with this notion. It's this idea of prosecutor versus felon, right? Harris was obviously attorney general in California, and she was a prosecutor, prosecuted a lot of people. Trump now a felon. There's this kind of irony, legal irony, I suppose, which the Democrats tended to use at the beginning of the campaign until I think they realized exactly what you mentioned, which is people don't really like that notion, especially a lot of people who think that the trial wasn't fair um, on multiple accounts. And so there's this catch 22, I think, regarding the hush money trial, both for the Democrats and for the Republicans, but especially for the Democrats, insofar as it's really a lose lose in terms of public perception in polling, right?
I think it's still a notion that's really resonating with a lot that are considering voting for Vice President Harris. I think that it is still going strong. She has been criticized by multiple sides for some decisions that she made while prosecutor. I think both candidates are having to deal with criticism of previous actions. That's not a new facet. That is not a new thing that's happening. However, I do think it is kind of falling on deaf ears for a lot of people who are already committed to voting for former President Trump. It has been interesting just over the summer. Obviously, we're in London recording this. I spent a lot of time back in the U.S. and across multiple states, and you do see while there are a lot of people who think it's a political plot, they think it's just Trump against the world. There are a lot of people who I think it isn't even about the unfairness of the trials. They have just accepted that felonies or not, they're still voting for Donald Trump.
No, I agree. It's certainly a very complicated election this year. It's a lot of things have happened, especially if you compare them to 2020, 2016. And we've seen, again, another notion that has been said in 2016 and 2020, been really published again this year, which is this is the most important election ever. We heard this when it was Clinton versus Trump. We heard it when it was Trump versus Biden. And certainly, again, this year, we're hearing that this is essentially life or death for America. And so we then naturally have to look at some of the other things that have happened over summer. Speaking of life and death, we look at the Trump assassination attempts. There have been two of them, but the first one in particular was the big one in Butler, Pennsylvania, when he was giving a speech at a rally for his presidential campaign, where he obviously got shot. A bullet scraped his ear. There was blood. The media must have loved it, right? It was on the front cover of every single major newspaper around the world, I'd say. for a week. Everyone was talking about it, and it naturally helped Trump's campaign as any assassination attempt would. We've seen this with Ronald Reagan, for example, when he had an assassination attempt on him, and it really helped him in the polls. Um, but do you think, had it not been for that assassination attempt, right, considering what had happened before, so Biden had just dropped out,
Hmm.
you had the assassination attempt, you have Harris coming in, how do you think the polls, or did you expect this kind of spike in Trump's polls and then Harris coming in, slight decline, and now it's kind of even-ish again? Obviously, Harris, at the time that we're recording this, is still leading
Hmm.
by a few percentage points, but it is still within the margin of error.
I think that before Harris even came into the picture, before she officially announced her campaign, like there was a really short time frame from the first assassination attempt before Biden officially decided that he was no longer running for office. And I think, gosh, that was such an opportunity for former President Trump. Like, and he had so much support. I think, obviously, it was a horrific act. And I think for a moment, not everyone, for a moment, you saw kind of the United States come together and agree this is not how we want it to go. This is not how we want our democracy to work. And he had the opportunity. I think he did capitalize on it and he was able to, have that work for him in the campaign. And then the RNC comes and people were really expecting this to change his rhetoric and to change the trajectory of the campaign. I really thought it would as well, and that he could come as a figure that would unify the country. And I think the whole country was kind of waiting for this. You were seeing people kind of tired of, obviously not everyone, you were seeing some people that were really tired of the Biden campaign and that were really concerned. And he, I think, didn't do what he could have done. He did not, I think, have a unification speech. He went back to a lot of his similar rhetoric. And so I think the polls didn't go in his favor as much as I thought they could have. And then Biden decides to drop out, the Harris campaign starts, and you see this boost of enthusiasm from the Democratic Party and from a lot of moderates who kind of were really in between and I think really could have ended up voting for Donald Trump, I think are now going to be voting for the Democratic Party.
Definitely, he really could have used the assassination attempt, the first one especially, to really boost his polls, boost his margins in the polls. And he did ultimately fail at doing that. We obviously saw within the kind of the first week and a half of the attempt, we did slightly see a kind of unified America. Like you
Mm-hmm.
said, Trump was, for once, not being perceived as the bully,
Mm-hmm.
but the bullied, right? And again, this links to the trials that we were talking about before and kind of that rhetoric that a faction of the Republican side, at least, that it's not a fair trial, so he's being persecuted politically. People are trying to kill him. He's the victim now. He's not the bully. And this is kind of the first time we've seen this since he's really entered mainstream American politics in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was slightly weird, right? Trump was he wasn't seen as the weaker one, but he was seen as the victim, and that's abnormal when it comes to Donald Trump, right? In American politics. But yeah, then like you mentioned, Harris came in, took over from Biden. She obviously had a huge spike in her polls. She was up by, I want to say at some point, 9% nationally. Obviously, that has dropped down since. Again, a lot of people call that the honeymoon phase, which is normal for any candidate, regardless of their parties. It's when a candidate steps in at a major turning point. It kind of really varies the polls. And now I think she's up by about 3%.
Yeah, depends on the day.
Right. Depends. Exactly. It's
Depends
American
on the day,
politics.
depends on the source,
Yes,
but she has been able to manage a slight lead.
she has. And we also see this in swing states. We see her in a lot of them, especially in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, for example. In Pennsylvania, she was up, which people say is the crucial state this year, as was in 2020. She is up by 1%. But again, 1% in American politics means absolutely nothing. And so we will have to wait and see what happens throughout the rest of the month,
Hmm.
going into the election, which leads us perfectly into the potential for an October surprise. which, if our viewers don't know, would you like to explain what an October surprise in American politics is?
Yes, so there's this notion, I'd even use the word conspiracy, but
Controversial.
that might be controversial. There is this idea that before a major presidential election or before any presidential election, there is something major that happens in October that will kind of radically alter the direction of the race, or just there's something that happens. And honestly, we talk about it in election years. Since I've been in London, I've had some professors say that just October, for some reason, I don't know if it's like people done with their summer vacays, like there's always something happening in October. I don't know if it's the change of the weather, but the question is, has this October surprise happened or not? There are some news sources that believe the kind of increase in tension and increase in action in the Middle East has been our October surprise. And the October surprise is really for Vice President Harris and how she will handle what is happening in the Middle East right now. Um, However, I don't know if that's it.
I personally wouldn't say that's it. I'm still waiting. I
I'm
mean,
still
I,
waiting.
I hope nothing major happens, obviously, but I mean, if you look at American polls and public opinion, in terms of the election, I think I can't remember the exact source, but there's a public opinion poll ranking the importance of different topics when it comes to voting for the president.
Hmm.
And foreign policy, I think, ranked ninth, right? Which is surprisingly low for a lot of people,
Hmm.
but it makes you realize that actually Americans, care more about stuff like the economy or immigration nowadays or reproductive rights and many, many more things before foreign policy. So I don't think that will play a decisive role in the election or in who wins the election. And so I'm really curious to see what happens in the next few weeks. Will there be another assassination attempt? I certainly hope not for either candidates. Will there be some sort of even further escalation, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, whether it's China in the South China Sea? But again, you look at foreign policy, and as I mentioned, it's not a big player really. Will there be another event around immigration? Will there be a surge in illegal immigration? And how does that affect Harris as the current borders are and going into the presidency? So, there's a lot of topics which could certainly happen in practice as well. I suppose we'll really have to wait and see if there will be an October surprise, or you never know. We
Hmm.
might have the most tense election in recent times with no really big October surprise, which I think a lot of Americans would like. I think a lot of Americans are looking at our politics nowadays and are saying, well, as entertaining as everything is, I think we would really prefer old school politics. We prefer just diplomacy. We prefer, the good old boring but policy based politics as opposed to, people shooting candidates or ad hominem attacks on a daily basis. And,
I think that is what they did in old school politics.
you
I don't
think?
know if people are, I don't know. We'll have to see. And we'll have to see if how people vote do kind of respond to that question. I think whether or not it's an October surprise, we still have about a month. A lot can happen. And I think that the Harris campaign has been very, very dedicated to defining's not the right word, but kind of sharing who Vice President Harris is as a person. I think with a short campaign, that's something that they've been focusing on a lot. We've had 4 years of former President Trump as a president, and then he has not been shy about showing who he is the last 4 years when he was not president. And so I think the surprise also might be, is she going to be able to do that in time for the polls? We'll have to see.
It's true. And I think this applies to both parties, really. I think they're both trying to portray the other side as the incumbent, even though theoretically neither of them are the current president.
Hmm.
Um, because if you look at American politics, especially in the last couple election or the last couple decades, presidential elections are really referendums on the incumbent, right? It used to be that if you're the incumbent, you have a huge advantage when seeking reelection. The majority of presidents who fulfilled one term and re-ran, they'd win. There are very few cases in American history where that wasn't the case. But you look at politics nowadays, and actually, if you're the incumbent, you run a pretty decent disadvantage, I'd say, because a lot of people are looking at your first term and they're saying, well, what have you done? And they're really holding you accountable. They're really scrutinizing whatever you've done. But this year, obviously, with none of them being president, they're both trying to portray the other as still being the incumbent. Harris is talking about Trump's first presidency and his first mandate and what he's done there. And she's also talking about, like you mentioned, what he's done since he's lost. Trump is saying, well, you've been the vice president the last 4 years, and look what you've done. And so it's this kind of back and forth of really de facto leadership, right, as opposed to de jure leadership.
Hmm.
And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And certainly that could be, like you mentioned, our October surprise. But again, it's American politics, Casey, so we will have to wait and see day by day because the polls are ever changing and you can't really trust what the poll says today and what the poll says tomorrow. And even what the poll says on November 5th, because we've seen recent elections really dictate differently, 2016 especially. And so October will theoretically play a key role in defining the victor. But you never know. We could have a very boring month ahead of us.
You never know. And when Patrick brings up the incumbent advantage, I think this is a good little segue to also mention we have spent this entire time talking about the two presidential candidates. That is very normal coming to a presidential election. I would also urge all of our listeners to pay attention not only to those running for president, but we've got a lot of elections that are coming up, a lot of seats in Congress, governors, local politics. And I think these are still positions where the incumbency advantage really is true. And so this would just be an urge to also read up on who's running for local office, who's running for seats in Congress. These are really influential positions in American politics. The president does not get to do everything as much as maybe they wish they could, or as much as we think they can. So, just a little side note.
It's the good old system of checks and balances.
Good old checks and
It
balances.
is. I think we'll leave it at that for today. Coming up in the next few weeks, we're going to have a lot of new podcasts. We're going to bring in a lot of members, a lot of speakers, hold some panels, some debates on the most relevant topics. But before we wrap up, we would really want to promote our election night event on November 5th. Obviously, that's when the election is, in collaboration with the KCL Politics Society and Roar News, where you're listening to this podcast right now. We will be hosting an all-night watch-along. It's going to be at the Vault, which is the King's College Student Union Bar on Strand campus, and it's going to be run from 9 p.m. all the way through 5 a.m. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a huge social. A lot of it is going to be live streamed on the Roar News YouTube channel. So it's going to be quite a formal, quite official thing,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also going to be all in all a very, very fun event. You're going to get to meet a lot of people. You're going to meet 3 entire societies and all their committees, and just a lot of fun, really.
Yeah, you'll have to come and see if you can stay up later than our committee. Spoiler alert, you will probably be able to stay up later than me. However, we're really excited. It's going to be a fun night.
We are. It really will. But that was it for the first episode. Casey, thank you for joining. Thank you for helping. And we're really excited, the both of us, for the year ahead, both in terms of American politics, but also as a society and our potential growth throughout the year. So thank you all for tuning in into the first episode of Kings Across the Pod, hosted by Roar News. I've been Patrick,
And I'm Casey Jane.
and see you next time.